I'm Bonnie Kempke. Welcome to my studio and welcome to Quilting on a Thread. Today I'm going to show you a couple of methods that I use to square up or to trim up, however you want to call it, but to clean up the perfect appearance of a quarter square triangle unit. Now this will work just as well if you're using a half square triangle unit, but there's two different ways that I will typically use to square these up. So I'm going to put you on hold and readjust my video equipment, and I'll be right back with you, and I'll discuss the various ways that I use to square these units up. All right, so the first method I'm going to use to create this perfectly squared up quarter square unit is to use a rotating mat. And this, if you have a rotating mat, it's a beautiful friend to have in your quilting studio. So the first thing I do if I'm squaring up on a rotating mat is I poke a needle through the point of my squares. And the only reason I'm poking that needle is to give me the ability to line my square up perfectly. Now, in this instance, all I have to do is bring that over and drop it. Make sure that the lines are on the 45-degree angles. Pull that pin out of the way. Now, I have never poked that pin into the mat. I just put it there to help me get my center point lined up perfectly, because it's very quick that way, because here I am on all 45s. Now that I'm laid out there on all 45s, I'm ready to go ahead and use either a straight ruler and cut all four sides, or my preference is to use a square ruler that has the diagonal in it. So this particular square needs to square up to 3.5 inches. So 1/2 of 3.5 inches is 1 3/4 inches. So on my ruler, I find the 1 3/4 intersection of that diagonal, which happens to be, let me see if you can, I don't know if you can possibly see it, but there's the 2-inch mark, and that is 1 3/4 across that diagonal. So I will look for that 1 3/4 and line that up on my center point of my square while keeping the diagonal point lined up on the square. And once I'm in place, I just drop that down, and then I look to make sure that my ruler is lined up equally using the sidelines of the, the sight lines of the marking on my cutting mat. And once I'm happy with how that's lined up, and I actually do need to lift that back up a little bit and move it just a smidge in this direction, because that's also going to wind up sitting on the quarter marking of the inch of my square ruler, of my rotating ruler. So once I'm lined up there, take my rotary cutter, cut that off. And if I'm comfortable doing it, I can go ahead and cut 2 without having to move anything at all. Now that I'm in place, I carefully, now that I've cut those 2 lines, I carefully move my ruler, my square ruler, out of the way, rotate my rotating mat halfway around, and go through the whole process all over again. Line up very carefully on that crosshatch. It should be on the quarter, and that's only because of this measurement. Remember that this is squaring up to 3.5 inches, so 1/2 of 3.5 is 1 3/4. So that means that I'm going to be actually here to line up on 3.5 inches. I'm going to be lining up on 1 3/4, because there's my center point. on the 2, but here I go, half a point, I'm on that quarter. I mean half of an inch, I'm on that quarter, 1 inch and 1/4 more, that's 1 3/4 of an inch. Then I take my rotary cutter and slice both of those. And I have a perfectly squared up quarter square unit. I know it's perfectly squared up. I can bring it over here and lay it right on top of my other unit, and they match perfectly. Set that aside. Now the other way of doing it, if you are not crafty enough that you have a rotary, pull that aside. And I'm just going to assume that I'm on a mat that does not have the diagonals. The diagonals on this mat are over on the left hand side, but I'm on the right hand side of this mat. So I'm going to assume that I don't have the diagonals. I'll once again take my pin. Let me get a different unit. There we go. So once again, I'll grab that pin and poke it right into the crossing of my seams. And again, I'm only using this so that I can line up. Okay, so the second way of squaring up a quarter square triangle unit is to assume you don't have a rotating mat. And to make this as simple as possible or as universal as possible, I'm going to do it over here on the right side of my mat where I don't have my diagonal lines. So once again, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to poke a needle through the center point of my quarter square triangle unit, and I'm going to use the point on the back side of the unit with my pinpoint, and I'm going to find a cross point on my mat. So now that I found the cross point on my mat, I'm going to line everything up and make sure that my diagonals are pointing to the appropriate cross hatches. And that's just a visual. So now I'm going to remove that needle. I don't need that needle any longer. And because this mat is very slick, I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of pieces of medical tape, holding my, move my unit. So let me reposition. Just want to make sure. And that's why, that's why the medical tape, because that unit is easily moved on here. So lining up my diagonals on the outside cross hatches that are going to come up. So that's basically to try and make sure that everything's on a 45. So I take my medical tape. You can use painter's tape. Just a piece of tape on the top and the bottom, just to keep it from moving around as I move my ruler around. So I'm going to again take my square ruler. This square ruler again has the 45 on it. So recall that this is a 3.5 inch unit that needs to be squared up. So 1/2 of 3.5 inches is 1 3/4. So I'm going to find that 1 3/4 point on the diagonal. I'm going to line that up in the center point, and I'm going to make sure that my ruler is lined up on the center point and that both the top and the bottom are at a 1/4 inch point. That's just for this measurement. So if I look at my ruler and I'm going across it, I'm actually coming to 3 3/4 of an inch. I mean 3 3/4 of an inch, and that's the square size. But from the center point out is 1 3/4 of an inch. Wait, let me restate that. it's coming out to 3.5 inches, and there's the part that has to be trimmed off, but the center point is 1 3/4 of an inch, which is 1/2 of 3.5 inches. So I'm going to take my up slice, get that out of the way, take my top slice, get that out of the way, and my tape is there holding that little bit, so I want to get that out of the way. Now I can carefully pick up my ruler. I have a piece of tape below, so it's not going to disturb my piece, and get my crumbs out of the way because I don't like them in my way. So come back again, find the 1 3/4 crosshatch on the 45 line, drop that down in place, make sure that my ruler is lined up on a 1/4 inch mark. It doesn't mean that it's the 1/4 inch mark, it's a 1/4 inch mark. So in this particular instance, it winds up being at 33 3/4 here, and it winds up being at 11 3/4 there, but the ruler is lined up on 1/4 inch marks, which means I'm lined up. As long as my center point is in place and I am lined up on a 1/4 inch mark on my ruler, on my cutting mat, then I'm lined up. So I do not like to cut with my left hand, so I'm going to stand up and cut down. Move that out of the way. Then I'm going to sit back down and do my bottom. Now remember, there's a piece of tape here, so that's going to hold that in place. Boom, boom. Get my scraps and crumbs out of the way. Pick my ruler up. Clean the tape off of my square. Grab a couple of odd strands. So I'll take my rotor color and just trim those off, but I have another perfectly squared piece. So I hope that those two methods will help you in your journey, and I'm gonna sign off here and hope to see you again here on Quilting on a Thread. Bye bye now.